All right, welcome into the Odds and Audibles podcast post game edition. I'm Matt Prehm. Erik Skopil is on the show as well. We're in our hotel rooms here at the beautiful Bayfront Hilton, right across the street from Petco, doing our first live stream post game edition. This is gonna be pretty exciting because Erik, God, we picked a perfect game to do this live. Um, so if you're on YouTube and you're watching this live stream, appreciate you guys jumping on and watching. Join the conversation, hit the chat. We'll keep track of that as well. We'll take your questions. If you're on the podcast, thank you for listening as well when this gets up. Uh, God, what a game. 28-27 Oregon victory over North Carolina. Bo Nix was tremendous down the stretch. Bucky Irving was terrific at the beginning of the game. And then Oregon's defense in that second half was highly impressive. They've taken a lot of flack this season. They played a tremendous second half. Second half, 6 points allowed, 120 yards total. And North Carolina averaged just 3.9 yards per play, 2 of 7 on third downs in that second half. Just a game. This was what the Holiday Bowl is always supposed to be. It's supposed to be exciting. It's supposed to be back and forth, and we got that came down to a 4th and 2 play at the 6 yard line of North Carolina for the game.
Yeah, and then we unexpectedly had to sweat out an extra point, which I will say, Matt wasn't sure if it went in. I wasn't sure if it went in until the officials put their hands up to signify it, and I put a little bad juju out pregame where we started talking about the last time Oregon played an overtime football game, and we were inches away from that being the case here. But fortunately, obviously, we didn't have that outcome. Oregon wins in regulation, and I think, as Matt said, just a really fun football game. I know for Oregon fans, I'm sitting in the chat here. Brendan Crabtree puts it well. Give him a heart attack. Yeah, I think a lot of people felt similarly. I know up in the press box, everybody was kind of sitting on pins and needles there. It was really unclear which way this game was going to go until the last 19 seconds. And shoot, the way games have gone for Oregon in history, and I guess you just kind of wondered, well, Drake May, he has a strong arm. He can get the ball to the end zone from about 50 yards. Let's hope this one gets knocked down and doesn't end up in even more misery. But, Oregon, I guess just to kind of put a bow on the season, 10 wins.
Yeah.
Love it.
And look, this was a game that I was on Pac-12 Sirius Radio this morning saying bet the over. This game might have 50 points each team. You were on saying the same stuff earlier this week, and there were 0 points scored in the third quarter, back and forth in the second half, and the under hit massively. And look, both teams' defenses weren't good this season, but I think there's just something to say about, you mentioned this on the way back to our hotel. Mace Funa in particular, he took a lot of flack from fans within the fan base at Oregon this season. He didn't play his best football every single game. He didn't play his best football, every half. And yet, in a game in which they were playing maybe the number one draft pick in 2024, Drake May, North Carolina's quarterback, without Christian Gonzalez, their best defensive player, without Noah Sewell, their best linebacker, and without DJ Johnson, the team's leading sack leader this season off the edge. Mace Funa delivered maybe his best game this season when Oregon needed it most, and it was 100% justified for him to get that defensive MVP. Pretty cool. There were a lot of just little storyline stories that you couldn't really script that just came out the way they did. That's perfect. Chase Cota being another one.
I was just going to say, I feel like the Chase Cota aspect of this, it really couldn't have happened more perfectly with, a player who grew up in Oregon, going to Autzen. His dad played at Oregon. His dad was a really good player at Oregon. For those who aren't familiar, go look up Chad Cota, played in the NFL. He came back to Oregon for his final season after going to UCLA to start his career. There was some coaching uncertainty. I think if there was more stability at Oregon at the time, he probably ends up playing his whole career here. But the fact that he came to Oregon for one season and then his final offensive snap gets to be a game-winning touchdown against North Carolina to conclude his career just really, really cool. And I think the other thing that there's a lot I'm sure we'll get to. I'm sure those in the comments here on the live stream will prompt others. But I just think the fact that Bo Nix, who really didn't play very well for parts of the second quarter with that interception, he mentioned that post game. He said he was ticked off going into locker room, was not in good spirits just because he felt like he let the team down. It was a bad throw. I think anybody watching that was kind of uncharacteristic, and he didn't play very well in the third quarter. I mean, I think I posted it on social media. He was 9 of 10 to start this game. A lot of it pretty easy stuff underneath, but then he was 5 for 10 with the interception and all the way through the third quarter, but finished the game, I believe, 9 of 10. 8 in a row at one point to kind of lead the Ducks back. And I thought he played really, really well down the stretch. There were some doubters. I saw it on social media. I saw it on our message board. People were wondering, how healthy is this guy? Like, what's going on here? But I just thought he showed the ability to kind of play through adversity. He's kind of that's been a trend all season with Bo Nix. And this just kind of, I think, reaffirms why Oregon fans are so excited about what the prospects are for him to come back next season. Hopefully you keep the guy upright for the full season, because I still contend had Bo Nix not suffer that injury against Washington, they have a very good likelihood of winning both those rivalry football games. And who knows where we are right now, Matt. We might not be in San Diego. We could be in another part of the country, whether it be Los Angeles for the Rose Bowl that would be kicking off in a few days, prepping for that, or maybe even in the college football playoffs. So there's obvious reason to why Bo Nix has been kind of such a, I guess, a fan favorite in Eugene. And I thought the way he concluded Wednesday's game was the reason why. They scored 14 points in the last 7 minutes of this game after really, really struggling to have any traction in the second half. I mean, you look at the drive chart, Matt, and I'm sure those listening are familiar as well, but I'll just run through it here. After the 2 touchdown drives, their first 3 drives, a touchdown, a field goal attempt that missed, and a touchdown. After that, interception, half basically ends. I think that was 1 snap. They punted to turn it over on downs. They punted. It just didn't like anything was working. And there's all these kind of questions out there. I think of, okay, is it the coordinator's issue? Is Bo not healthy? Is North Carolina's defense better than we thought? Which I think, as we've talked about in this podcast setting up, no one thought they were very good. And yet, look how this game concluded. 2 basically length of the field drives, both about 2 minutes in length, and Nix completing touchdown passes. First, Troy Franklin with a great catch, and then Chase Cota, obviously, to put the Ducks ahead for good. I just thought he played, and the offense as a whole came together when they were really called upon at the end there.
I just saw this on Twitter via the Sickos Committee. It's a Twitter account that just enjoys like crazy, off the wall, and sometimes bad football. They are calling the Camden Lewis off the upright kick the duck doink for the lead. I mean, I don't know how many people know the history of this bowl. I was here in 2000 as an 8th grade kid when Joey Harrington caught that pass from Keenan Howery and stumbled his way into the end zone. That was a 4th quarter comeback by Oregon to win this game. They did it again against Mac Brown because Mac Brown was the head coach then at Texas in 2000. Crazy. So they have beaten Mac Brown in the Holiday Bowl now twice in crazy fashion. 3rd time that they've won the Holiday Bowl in its entirety. They're now 3-1. Just
all 3 wins over Mac Brown, by the way, because the other one was his last game at Texas.
Yes, they're also 3-0 against Mac Brown just personally.
It's kind of a weird deal.
But this was just, look, you don't want to make too much of the lower tier bowls, but there's something different about how this season is going to be looked at now moving forward, because you talked about it in the press box. Like, there's just a different feeling when you lose 3 out of your last 4, like Oregon did last year. And a couple of those, they were not competitive. Now, this year, Oregon was competitive. Oregon should have won the 2 games that they lost at home against Washington, on the road at Oregon State. But it happened. They lost. And they have a win over Utah sandwiched in between those. But to win this game, even though we can argue maybe North Carolina isn't a ranked opponent, maybe they come from a weak conference, maybe the worst division at the Power 5 level, But it doesn't matter. You won the game. You end the season with 10 wins, like you said, and you go into the offseason with momentum, with positive momentum. It doesn't really matter who you play, what level of bowl the game this is. The fact that you have that ride of that high of winning the game, the post game celebrations, we were down there on the field watching it play out, and you could tell this team cared about winning this game and just what it could mean individually to send off its seniors or the guys that are going pro, and more importantly, what it could mean to just give that team just a little bit extra juice, motivation to work a little bit harder next season. Because, like you said, like we easily could have been somewhere else in a part of the country covering a much bigger game, and that could be that carrot that you dangle in front of this team the rest of the way. Like, hey, look, you finished the season strong, then let's do the whole season next year.
And you mentioned how close this season was to being one way. This game was very close to being an Oregon loss, and
Yeah.
I think the way to kind of measure what you were saying earlier about the value of ending a season on a win is how different is this podcast? How different was that press conference over at Petco Park, which we can basically see from our hotel? If they don't convert that game, if Camden Lewis just duck doink doesn't end up going through, a game goes to overtime, they lose, or if Oregon doesn't convert on that fourth down play to chase Coda for the win, or if a handful of things don't go their way, we're having a different conversation here. The folks in the chat, which I think so far seem like they're all pretty darn fired up, are also feeling completely differently about where things are at. And we're probably fielding a lot of negative questions. And I'm sure when we get through our question part at the back end, and don't worry, guys, we'll get to your questions and your comments here probably in the next 5 to 10, 15 minutes, something like that. But the whole tenor of this would be completely different. And I think there is a lot of validity to ending the season on a win. I don't know how much it ends up changing things from like the national pundits and how they're talking about Oregon. But here's what I will say is when you look back years from now at this season, there is a difference to a 10-win season versus a 9-win season and how that is going to be looked at. And for Dan Lanning to finish his first season with 10 wins, a very tumultuous season with all sorts of ups and downs, and for it, at least the final note of it to be a positive, I think that's really special and important for this group. And, this team will, work really, really hard this offseason to get better and to try to do better next season. And it'll be a completely new look team. We'll talk about some of that in later podcasts, but we've been talking about it off the record of like half this team could be new players, at least from a scholarship perspective in 2023. But a lot of the core guys will be back, including Mace Funa. We should note, those who maybe missed the tweet, Mace announced after the game in the press conference that he will be coming back. There was an opportunity for him to leave should he have wanted to, but he did have the COVID year. Sort of a weird deal. Matt, we were talking about it on a walk earlier today about how like 50% of college football players now have some sort of an announcement to make at the end of their seasons, whether it's I'm going to enter the transfer portal, whether it's I'm going to go pro, whether it's I'm not going to go pro. There's so many different decisions that have to be made. And obviously over the next couple of weeks, we'll learn more of those, of which additional players might hit the portal, which players might choose to enter the NFL draft, which players will return and whatnot. But there will be certainly a core group of guys back that will, carry a lot of the load along with new additions. And I do want to comment, I'll bring up this comment from Oscar about the fact that Taki Taimani also tweeted he was coming back shortly after the game. So a couple of guys in the front seven today, at least, made commitments for the 2023 season to return to Oregon.
Yeah, and we're going to wait on Brandon Dorles's decision. Like Erik and I have said on this podcast, like, why would he play in this game if he's not coming back? I'm taking the same approach that we did with Bo Nix prior to Bo Nix's decision about coming back. Like, there's certainly that chance that Dorles goes pro, but I think right now I would lean towards him coming back, which would be a huge addition to that Oregon front seven next season. Real quick, just to catch you up to speed on just a couple stats here. Bo Nix finishes the game 23 of 30, 205 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, had a quarterback rating of 149. Terrence Ferguson, I forgot the stat because of how crazy the game got towards the end of the season, or towards the end of the game. But he finishes with, I just lost it here.
84 yards.
84 yards on 7 targets. That's the most yards an Oregon player at the tight end position has had since, I believe, the 2019 season when Jacob Breland did it. And the reason I'm only uncertain here is I can't remember if it's 84 by Breland or if it's 82 by Breland. So we may have seen the best tight end performance in a long time by Terrence Ferguson. And then Bucky Irving, the fourth time he had 100 yards in a game, 149 total rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. His 66-yard touchdown run goes down as the third longest touchdown run in Holiday Bowl history. And we should note the guy that holds that record, Jeremiah Johnson, in 2008 against Oklahoma State. And then number 2 is Barry Sanders in that game. Defensively, Mace Funa has 7 tackles. He had 2 tackles for loss. Keith Brown, this is a guy that hasn't played a lot. And it's kind of segues into maybe with some stuff that we heard press conference wise. Dan Lanning, I asked him about the defense. He said there were a ton of guys in this game that either played limited snaps, played maybe in a couple games this season, and then even a couple guys that just straight up hadn't played all year that had to play. And he was really proud of just the commitment, the effort, and the belief that these guys who hadn't played a lot ended up doing good things. He singled out Micah Roth, a walk-on linebacker who, Erik, I think he was in the game like in the fourth quarter, late on the field. Those are just cool stories. Those are cool moments, and this is why these bowl games can still present cool storylines, because we see stuff like tonight where guys who just didn't play. And Mac Brown said it too for North Carolina, that they had guys who made plays in big moments when they just hadn't played all year.
Yeah, it's a skeleton crew basically for both teams at this point. I don't know the exact scholarship count, but I think it's close to 62, 61, somewhere in that range that Oregon had tonight. I don't know for Carolina what the number was, probably a little bit more. But you're looking at it from an Oregon perspective, like, a quarter of your roster wasn't playing in this game. And some of those guys weren't key players, and about, 5, 6, 7, handful or so of those guys were really key players. Matt ran through earlier, and I think those listening are familiar with who wasn't out there, but key players on defense in particular didn't play in this game. And yet I think, I'll do my game grades either tomorrow or on Friday. I think this is probably one of the better overall defensive performances of the season when you consider the talent at quarterback you're facing. And I know Drake May finished the game with 3 touchdown passes, but I thought they did a pretty good job in general. He was 18 for 35, had 200 yards passing. Oregon against the run, I thought was really productive. Held North Carolina to just 129 yards rushing, 84 of those by non-quarterbacks. May had 45 yards of those, averaged just a little under 4 yards per carry as a team. Like I thought Oregon defensively played one of its better games. Actually got to the quarterback a little bit, which is an issue down the stretch of the season. What was the stat? We ended up with 4 sacks over the last 5 games, or 3, something like that.
It was 3 over the last 6, 1 over the last 4, and they had 1 sack in the first 3 plays of the game.
Yeah, and they finished with 2 here. I thought there was a third, but I think they must have determined that he was either at the line of scrimmage or that it was a scramble for a tackle for loss, because I thought that there was a third sack. But regardless, I thought the pressure was a little bit better. Obviously, it's not perfect, and there's a whole bunch of holes you can run through here. I mean, the fact that North Carolina concludes this game 3 of 3 on 4th downs. I think they scored points of some kind on all 3 of those drives. 6 of 15 on 3rd downs. These aren't great stats in those situations, but I agree with what you said earlier, Matt. This was undoubtedly one of the stronger performance from a defense which has been much maligned this season. And as we said, we both thought like this game might, be 90 combined points, and it ends up being 55 combined.
All right, let's take a quick break. If you're on the live stream, don't leave. We're going to just stop talking for 2 seconds. You're going to see some behind-the-scenes action of our production on the podcast. If you're on the podcast, you're going to hear some commercials here in a second. Don't leave either, because we'll start taking your questions here on the chat. So stay tuned with that real quick. All right, welcome back to the Odds and Audibles podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil from our hotel rooms in San Diego. Real quick before we dive into these, if Oregon ever comes back here and it's within your means financially to go to this bowl game, please go. This place is freaking awesome. The Petco Park, the field conditions terrible, but that's about the only bad thing about this place from our experience. We've been here since the 26th, and our hotel is 5 minutes from the stadium. There's bars everywhere. There's food everywhere. It's kid friendly. It's adult friendly. if Oregon ever comes back here, and look, we're not being paid to say this. It's truly awesome to come here. So if you are considering going to a game in which Oregon plays down here in San Diego in the future, do it. It's worth it. You'll have a good time. All right,
can we start with a light question here, Matt? And it's for you in particular from Dennis Mackey.
Sure.
Matt, question for you: how was the car ride down with James Crepia? Did you get to say anything along the way?
Oh, Dennis, I love it. I did get in some stuff with James. We love James here on the pod.
Yeah, we're actually big James fans here, which might surprise some of these. James is genuinely a really good person. I hope. Yes. I know people get frustrated with his questions sometimes. He's a really good guy.
Yes, James. If you're a listener and you're unfamiliar with Dennis's question, James and our flight got delayed on Christmas Eve. I don't know why Eric's didn't, but ours did, and then it got canceled, and we had to drive 15 hours in a truck. Saturday or Sunday night into Monday morning. Left at 6:30 in Eugene. Got to San Diego at 9:30 in the morning. Hit the ground running. I'm ready to go home. It's been a long week, but like I said, it's been awesome here. And to see this team win this game after what James and I had to go through made that trip worth it. Made that drive worth it. I do have one also queued up here. It's from Fishboy. Talk about the players calling plays on the field. It was great to hear that Forsyth calls a running play that ends up with a touchdown. This isn't necessarily a question, but more so just a point. If you're unfamiliar with what happened in the press conference, Dan Lanning informed us that Bo Nix is the one that made the call to Chase Cota. And then Bo Nix also informed us that Bucky's 66-yard touchdown run, which, by the way, I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, Eric, I think that's the best run he's had all year. 3 cutbacks against the North Carolina defense, pulled away at the end for a touchdown. Alex Forsyth called that play, or suggested that Bo call that play, at least. It was pretty cool moments.
Yeah, it was a run check. So, like, just to clarify small details, that was a run check, which is basically through their line of scrimmage, and Alex got them out of whatever the previous call was into that one. And then it sounds like, according to Dan, like, Bo straight up in the huddle was like, we're running this particular play. And we'll have full quotes up from that on the site. I think
Jared got him up.
Jared already has it up. So if you want to go read the transcripts, you can read that. There's probably a tweet out with that whole link, so you guys can take a read of everything that was said at the press conference, about 15 minutes. But it is cool when you get into a situation where the players are, not only do they have skin in the game from play on the field, but also from kind of making decisions in key spots. And I think it's really cool, that they have that agency and autonomy, but also that Dan and Bo in particular just kind of like made that known to us. Like, I think that's what the fans want, is that kind of peek behind the curtain of what is it like on the field. Like, there's so much in this game that is so complicated that is lost on so many of us. But to hear Dan kind of be like, hey, sorry to cut you off, James, but let me tell you that Bo actually made that call. And then for Bo to be like, hey, Alex was the one who got us into that run for the Bucky touchdown, which I agree, Matt. That's probably his best run. And gosh, one of the better individual Oregon skill position plays I've seen in a long time. The guy is so electric at the football. And I also don't know if I like it full time next year, but definitely the most dynamic kick return guy they've had in a long time too. I know he didn't take any too far. I think what was his long, about 35 yards. Mm-hmm. Ball gets in that guy's hands, good thing happened. And I think I'd like to see them at least consider, maybe toy with the idea of having him back there every now and then. Of course, the reason you don't do that is it opens him up to injury, but gosh, he is so fun to watch out there whenever he touches the football. And I think you have to be really excited with what this offense can be with Bo back, but also with Bucky and some of these skill guys back.
All right. Next question here from Dan Johnson. Hey, it's late. It's almost 11 o'clock. We have almost 200 people on this live stream, by the way. That's phenomenal. Keep it up. Like it. Subscribe to the show. Share it. That'd be awesome for us. But Dan Johnson asks, is this the best game for Lanning's made adjustments in? Thought his second half defensive adjustments made the difference. I don't – it's tough to answer on the fly, but I think up there. It has to be. I mean, to know the players that they were without, Noah Sewell, DJ Johnson, Christian Gonzalez, they didn't have their top linebacker in Sewell. And then on top of that, they didn't have their third and their fourth string linebackers because they transferred, Jackson LeDuc and Justin Flo. They were out a lot of guys up front and at the edge positions because of transfers. Some of them played, some of them didn't play, but those guys were still valuable because of a scout team performance. And yet, 6 points in the second half. 21 first half points for North Carolina, 6 in the second to keep them out of the end zone. And look, a couple times they got real close to scoring too. So it's if it's not the best second half adjustment, it's got to be 2 or 3.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and rewatch the game and to kind of get a feel for what some of those specific adjustments were. But the stats bear out this is one of the better defensive performances with the game on the line, without question. Matt ran through it 6 points in the second half, also only 120 yards, which is really, again, impressive. We've said it a couple times already in this podcast, but the fact that this game was only 28-27 when I think I predicted 49-44. Matt had 49-45. I want to say Jared had 49-38. And by the way, Jared is back in Boston and it's like 2 a.m, so he's not on this podcast.
He was a victim of the Southwest cancellations, just like I was.
Yeah, he was supposed
to. It's a lot harder to drive to San Diego from Boston than it is.
Yeah, he was supposed to be in a hotel room doing a podcast with us tonight. Unfortunately, he can't, and I'm sure we'll get his thoughts at some point. But no, I guess I just think defensively, there were some players who made really good plays, but I think it was Mace Boone who said it was really just down to all 11 kind of being in the right spots, playing really well. And I thought, again, there's certainly, I don't want to represent it as this was like a breakthrough defensive performance because the season's ending and there were a ton of flaws and there's a lot of things that you definitely want to see worked on. And I think the thing to have maybe some optimism going to next season is through the portal with some additions that have already happened, with some additions obviously in the recruiting class, the talent will be closer to a Dan Lanning roster than it was this year. Because again, this year's team is what 70% not his guys. Next year's team will be probably closer to 70% his guys. So
I mean, if they're adding 40 players, it might be close to 90.
Yeah, you're right. It could be almost the entire team. So no, I think, yeah, to kind of back to the original question, I think this is pretty impressive the way the defense played down the stretch, and you give credit to the players and you give credit to Coach Lanning for getting in better situations, because I thought there were times in the first half that were really frustrating. The fact that you turn it over on, and we haven't talked about the bizarre nature of that interception by North Carolina, which by the way is like, I've never seen anything quite like that. I think it was it Washington, Arizona, like 15 years ago, had the ball off the heel of a guy get intercepted for like a pick six to win a game. It was something like that. There's a Pac-12 after dark game years ago. I was at Gonzaga in college at a college party, probably had a couple beers, and so that's probably why I'm not remembering all the details. I remember there was something weird like that. That was the only thing I could think of that was like that, but I thought it was really disappointing that there were like 40 seconds left on the clock and it was 51 yards and Oregon gave up a touchdown on the next play. Bennett Williams gets beat, I think, playing a little bit of man coverage there by an inside receiver, and that's kind of a tough spot for him to be in. But in general, like, I thought the way they responded in the second half was, as we've already said, really impressive.
Oscar asked for this question. He later follows it up. It wouldn't make sense to just include the follow-up, but he's asking, how does Drew Mehringer, and then updated it with Matt Powledge, potentially leading affect Oregon? If you missed this, you probably did, because it literally came out right when the game started by Bruce Feldman of The Athletic that he was reporting Baylor was zeroing in on its defensive coordinator search on Oregon's Matt Powledge. He is Oregon's co-defensive coordinator, and he coaches the safeties for the Oregon Ducks. And it's an interesting move. It's one, he's from the state of Texas area. That's where a lot of his history is in coaching. And at Oregon, he's kind of pigeonholed in what he can do. He's kind of bracketed up because Tosh Lupoy is the higher elevated defensive coordinator, the higher paid coach at that position group. And on top of that, everyone kind of knows, just like when it was Chip Kelly as head coach and Mark Helfrich as OC, this is Dan Lanning's defense. And Dan Lanning's fingerprints are all over it. It's kind of why Dan Lanning left Georgia, is to show that, hey, I'm a good coach beyond Kirby Smart stuff and yada, yada, yada. So this is a similar deal. You had a great point before the game started. I'll let you explain it. But, yeah, I think this is certainly something to monitor.
What was my point about Matt Powledge? Sorry, I feel like I make so many great points. So
yeah, you said when these types of tweets come out from national media members saying like they're zeroing in. I mean, Woj does this all the time for ESPN for NBA rumors. Bruce Feldman does the same thing. When it's zeroing in, it basically means it's done, and they're just waiting for things to get finalized and announced.
Yeah, no, you're exactly, and I wouldn't be surprised with Palage's news if that happens in the next 48 hours. Shoot, that news could come out while we're on this podcast, and and to the question about like what's the impact there, it hurts your Texas pipeline in recruiting. If you Matt, I know you wrote a story shortly after signing day this year about just how that pipeline kind of came together and how many players they signed, and obviously, Austin Novosad is on offense. Ashton Kozart is a receiver. So there's two of those guys on the other side of the football. But they also brought in three on defense. There are a couple other targets we know Oregon is zeroing in on in its own right that are from the state of Texas. Ashton Porter being somebody who's been getting quite a bit of attention. Those are the type of things where maybe it impacts from a recruiting perspective. Coaches, defensive backs, safeties is probably the better way to put it. So you're going to have to you will replace him with somebody. We'll get it's too early for me to really come together with any list of who possible candidates are, but we'll have something up on the site, in the next couple of days, probably kind of once this becomes official, of who might be good candidates, who makes sense. Maybe some of the coaches Dan worked at in the past at various stops, people that maybe Tosh has connections to. You typically you see, obviously Will Stein being not a good example because I don't think anyone on the staff really had much connection with him, but typically you're going to see these sort of hires have a connection or two to Oregon staff, and I'm sure they'll get out there and try to find somebody once this becomes finalized, assuming it does. As we said, it's probably very close to being done, might even already be done, but we'll wait till something official comes out. And another question I've got here, that just a really quick one to clarify, from Rick Olson, who called the plays as the offensive coordinator. With Kenny Dillingham not here, it came down to Drew Maringer and Junior Adams, the tight end and receivers coach, to game plan it. And then Drew Maringer was the actual one kind of, I guess, making the final calls out there from the box. I assume from the box. We couldn't figure out where, by the way, the coordinators were calling this game. That's something we haven't talked about too much, is just that this was played in a baseball stadium. So there's all these kind of weird logistical things that were strange. Like, we were in one of the end zones. Like, we didn't have, like, if the ball was going into the end zone that had the Oregon lettering, we had no vantage point there. Like, there were a couple of times when Bucky had runs and we're like, was that a 7-yard run? And it was like a 15-yard run. So there were some kind of weird things playing in a stadium like that. So I'm not really even sure where Drew was calling the game from, but he and some of the assistants were somewhere up in the box, I would assume, making the calls. And Maringer and Adams both have offensive coordinator play calling experience from previous schools. So Oregon was in a position where you had some options. And I know there was some frustration overall in this game with play calling. I think we probably share some of it. But that was who was in charge of the offense in place of Dillingham.
That segues right into that. I was just going to transition this question based off of that. Just what did we think of the overall offense without Kenny Dillingham? I thought Bo looked uncomfortable for the first maybe second and third quarters of that game. I don't know how much of that was his health, because you mentioned he just didn't look right running the football still.
He looked hesitant. He looked hesitant, right?
Yeah, like maybe he didn't trust that he was fully healthy, or maybe he isn't fully healthy. We don't know. But in that fourth quarter, he was good. 7 straight completions. I think he completed 8 of his last 10 in that game, the last one being the touchdown. I thought it was weird in the first half, and for the third quarter, they didn't really try to challenge North Carolina vertically, especially when they had 3 starters in the secondary opt out and transfer. But in that fourth quarter, they pushed the ball down the field, and they had maybe their 2 most explosive drives of the game. I mean, Bucky's 66-yard run was a 4-play drive, but that was 1 play. Whereas it felt like the last 2 drives to win the game, to get down by 3, they scored a field goal to get up by 6 again, and they scored a touchdown to win. Those 2 drives, like, there were chunk plays after chunk play after chunk play, and that felt like the offense that we were seeing before Bo's injury, and even against Oregon State. So I don't know, like, it definitely wasn't the same, but I felt like maybe they made some adjustments. And I saw another comment in the comments section that seeing 3 timeouts in that final drive was like a mirage, because how many times had previously seasons did we see timeouts get blown for no reason?
Yeah, no, that was really significant. That was a game where if you have one fewer timeout, you might not have time to get that
Yeah.
last touchdown to chase. And kind of my reaction just to the play calling in general was I thought the game was pretty well scripted early. Like I think you go
Yeah.
back and look at the way the game started. Oregon had a lot of success on its opening 3 drives, moving the football. Really, the only reason they didn't score a touchdown or any points in the second was Camden misses the field goal, but they got off schedule based on a sack that North Carolina had that pushed Oregon back. I think it was a first down sack, which are
It
almost kind
was.
of the worst ones because now you're really behind the 8 ball for the second and third down situations there, and Oregon just never get back into situation to convert. But what I thought I saw was Oregon made a real concerted effort to run the football early, had a lot of success with it. And then in the second half, especially that third quarter, credit to North Carolina for responding, putting more players in the box, making it difficult for Oregon to run. And the response, and you look at the drive chart here, Oregon to start the second half, 3-and-out, punt, punt, and I think a combined 60 yards or so of total offense on those 3 drives. Just really didn't have a whole lot of anything going. And you can credit Maringer for making an adjustment to decide to throw the football, or you can just recognize the fact that at that point in the game, you have to trust your quarterback. You're down 10 points with 9 minutes to play. You don't really have any choice but to throw the football. But that shift obviously ended up being significant. 2 deep balls down the field to Troy Franklin were drew interference calls, which I think were almost as important as any completion on any of those drives besides the touchdowns. So obviously the decision to throw the football was key. And to the point about Bo earlier, he looked hesitant as a runner until they he had a pretty nice designed run on that final drive, I think it was, or I can't remember. Those are kind of running together if it was the final or the second one, the one before. So maybe he had got a little more confidence as the game was going. I don't know, but certainly you saw confidence in him as a passer improve as the game went on. And I thought he had some really nice throws late. And I think one play that doesn't end up counting, but was one of the better throws and catches of the season was the Chris Hudson touchdown, which
Oh,
came back on the player downfield penalty on Harper. But that was an absolute rope on the run, and I think it was a one-handed catch. It looked like from our vantage point by Hudson.
he caught it one-handed and then pulled it into his chest to catch
Right.
it. 1 foot toe grab on the cornerback of the end zone too. That was a phenomenal catch. It was a damn shame that play didn't count because that could have been a Sports Center top 10 type play. But then, like 2 plays later, Troy Franklin also. I mean, also did you see the window? I don't. We were watching live. The window to get that in was extremely small.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch that one again a couple times from different angles because it was a small window, and I think he basically fingertipped it to keep it off the turf. And Troy Franklin's been awesome all year in terms of making those tough catches. But yeah, that one probably gets overlooked a little bit just because Coda ends up with the game winner. But that's a must play, a play that's a must by Franklin there. He pulls that one in. That was a big call, or a big play, I should say.
Joseph Bonin, how beneficial is it to have Funa and Taki returning for next season? If you're new on the stream, you missed it. Mace Funa, after the press conference was over with, was asked if he's going to come back or go pro. He said he's coming back for what would be his 5th and final season at Oregon. And then Taki, Erik mentioned it at the beginning of the show that he announced that he's also coming back to Oregon next season. So 2 key guys up front for Oregon and their defense in 2022 are indicating they're coming back for what would be, I think, their 5th and 6th years of college football.
5th for Funa for sure. It's harder with Taki because he started his career at Washington, so I don't remember exactly what his timeline is. It's 5 or 6. Yeah, I mean, Taki didn't start this year. Jordan Riley, I should say, started at nose tackle. I think all 13 games. He doesn't have any more eligibility, so there is an open spot there. Taimani has a chance to fill it. I think another player to note is Popo Amavai. We're not sure on the medical waiver, but Dan has been pretty confident, at least publicly, about that getting approved. And I know Popo wants to come back, so that could be another player who will be on this defensive line. Having Funa back at edge at least gives you a starting caliber player to build off of. I think he played awesome tonight. I would still like to see them try to upgrade that position going forward, or at least add a couple players to compete for Funa for that full-time job. I don't want to take anything away from Ace because, as you said earlier, and I would agree, I think that's his best game in Oregon colors to this point. Started, played basically every snap, was really effective as a pass rusher. Had the one sack, was also a part of, again, I think I mentioned the play earlier where it looked like May maybe scrambled and he and Dorless helped bring him down together, where they called that a tackle for loss, I think, rather than a sack because he had forward momentum, which is a bummer because I think people like this. A shared sack has a little bit more value than a shared tackle for loss, probably to some who are just looking at the stats. But I think Funa's a player who came on strong at the end of the season. I still think there is room to find somebody who's maybe a little bit more reliable as a pass rusher, even though we saw some really nice things tonight. They hit that position really hard. And obviously, Mateo Uangalele is a huge addition, a 5-star recruit who plays the same spot. So that might be just a natural competition there. But I'd still like to see them go find a guy in the portal to compete there, to maybe somebody who's had starting experience or at least has had a role as a regular pass rusher. Because I know they were a little bit better today, but the fact that you finished the season, I think, with total of 18 sacks in 13 games. I know 16 and 12 coming in was like the 6th worst total in the nation this year. And this is a Dan Lanning, that's one of the things that his defenses at Georgia were really successful with, was we're being disruptive on passing downs. Really didn't see it come together this season enough. And that's why I think it's important to still go find somebody to add there, a player, maybe 2 players, or you just hope some of the guys you've added are able to contribute really quickly.
Ben Reese, at the end of the day, we got a new coach and we won 10 games and won a bowl game. I'm pretty stoked. I was asked this question on Pac-12 Sirius Radio this morning, Erik, and I want to know what your perspective is. How would we grade year 1 under Dan Lanning? I'm sure you're going to do a full story, maybe grading the position units as the season progresses, but just the year for Dan Lanning in year 1. My knowledge, he becomes the second head coach since, I'm pretty sure, ever to win a bowl game in his first season. Mark Helfrich did it in 2013 when they beat Matt Brown, of all people, in that Alamo Bowl with Marcus Mariota. Willie Taggart didn't do it. Margaret Cristobal didn't do it. Chip Kelly didn't do it. Mike Bellotti didn't do it. And I'm pretty damn sure Rich Brooks did not coach in a bowl game in his first game way back when. So there's that stat. We also know that Dan Lanning, from a recruiting perspective, signed the league's best recruiting class early signing period, 5th straight year in a row. That's happened for the Oregon Ducks in the Pac-12. But they also lost to rivals Washington and Oregon State, and in ways in which they should have won. They got embarrassed week 1 against Georgia. But they came back and they beat Utah, who ended up winning the league. And they were clearly the better team in that game. And they win a bowl game. They get to 10 wins. And they were preseason number 12. They're probably going to end up right around where they were preseason-wise.
If I'm giving a grade here, and I haven't put a ton of thought into this, but I'll just kind of roll with it. I'd probably give it a solid BB+. They hit the benchmark of winning a bowl game. They got 10 wins. Not reaching a conference championship game, which broke a 3-year streak of at least playing for it, is certainly disappointing. And then I think when you add on, and I know there's a lot of factors to why these games, and the margin of error in both conference losses to Washington and Oregon State was super thin. Comes down to play here, play there. Those losses just have to be included in the season and the way it played out. Because this could have very easily, with the response after Georgia, been an A sort of a season, but they just couldn't finish those 2 games. And if they finish those 2 games, we've said this before in this podcast, there's a chance we're having these discussions from a totally different location. Oregon's playing in a bigger bowl game. There's so many what ifs this season, but I think a B+ is probably the right mark for Dan. And I thought, as we said earlier on this show, I thought he finished the season, at least in this bowl game, strong. And I shouldn't say the season, because the regular season finale against Oregon State's probably the worst this team played all year, especially in that end of third to the fourth quarter. But this was an impressive showing, and to get to 10 wins, to not get blown out after the first game. I know the first game leaves a sour taste in a lot of people's mouth, as it should. I thought this was a pretty darn impressive debut season from Dan, and kind of frankly about where I thought it would be. I think I predicted 9-win regular season plus a bowl win. I had them winning the Pac-12 as well. So they didn't quite get there, but I thought this reached a lot of the benchmarks you'd like to see for a debut coach with a lot of questions going into the season.
Yeah, I said B plus, so we're right around the same area. I felt like the teams that they lost to are kind of unforgivable sins for the season, and especially in the manner in which they did. But status quo remains the same for recruiting. Best in the conference. They get the double wins. They get a bowl victory. They beat a team with a winning record in a bowl game, with a good record in the bowl game, 9-4 going into this one. They were division champs. Whether it's the worst division in Power Five, it's still division champs. And so I'm with you. I think B plus is right around where they should be.
I've got
another. Go ahead.
I've got one while you find it, and it's just going to be quick. From Dennis Mackey, who's coming in with the fire from the humor perspective. Skopil, which if you haven't followed, I read a weekly column called Skopil, where I make 5 predictions. Will I find true love this next year? Well, Dennis, I'm going to say you will, because I'm trying to be an optimist on this show, Dennis. I think it's your year. I'll also say my clip on return on these is like 25%. So I'm not very good at hitting these. In fact, I think I missed all 5 tonight. Did Oregon get over 230 rush yards?
Oof,
they did. Close. They did not. So I fall short on all 5. So I'm not sure I'm really the expert to ask about, but I'm going to give you optimism going into 2023. It's going to be a good year, Dennis.
Let me see here. I'm trying to find it. There was a question about Casey Rogers and just his decision as can he come back?
He can't come. I'll answer the question while you try to find it, but he can come back. He has another year of eligibility with the COVID year. I know he's really close with Bo Nix, and I believe Bo Nix's wife and Casey's, I want to say girlfriend, fiance, wife. I'm not sure, but where their relationship status is, are like become best friends because they're living out here. Those are 2 of the older players in the teams with a long-term relationship. So I think that'll play a factor. I kind of expect he'd come back, but you also have to recognize in these decisions sometimes there's a lot at play. Guys originally from New York, went to prep school after high school, and I think is about 24 years old already. So there's also an element of, like we talked about this with Cam McCormick, of like they've got a year back. They certainly love to keep playing football, but there's also just the reality of how long do you want to do school? How long do you want to continue to be a college athlete and kind of delay whatever the professional endeavors would be? I think Rogers has an opportunity to play professional football at some level if he wants to pursue it. But I would kind of lean that he might make a decision to come back. And it certainly probably is improved by the fact that Bo has decided to do so, because those 2 are really close.
All right, we're going to take a couple more questions as they come in. Almost 300 people on this live stream. Absolutely phenomenal. This isn't really a question, but it's more just a comment that I think we should discuss. Offense was a big surprise this year, as well as the defense, for all the wrong reasons, coming from Bro Knows. 100% agree. I felt like going in, I think you would say the same thing.
Yeah.
It was a team I felt like was going to lean on its experience defensively, lean on its talent defensively, and win a lot of games like this game was actually played. 28-27, close, back and forth, lean on your defense, make turnovers. By the way, no turnovers for Oregon's defense in this one. Pretty shocking there. Offense was absolutely tremendous this season. Huge, improvement in areas I just didn't expect to see. Players playing well above what I expected them to do. You probably would say the same. But the question now becomes, where does this turn into 2023? Because DJ Johnson's gone. Sewell's gone. You also lose Christian Gonzalez. Bennett Williams is graduating, and he's off roster next season. Defensively, you're going to have a lot of key guys have to get replaced. You're going to have a lot of depth replaced as well. And offensively, you lose 3 out of your 5 starters on the offensive line.
I think it's 4, right?
4? Yeah, I guess it's 4. Because we did see one of them get put into the starting lineup because of injuries. But nonetheless, 4 starters along the offensive line are now gone. And then Cam McCormick, we don't know. There's definitely rumors that he could be back, but he could also be gone. for the very reasons that you mentioned about just being done with school. Chase Cota is gone. We've seen Dante Thornton leave. We've seen tight end Maliki Mataval leave. Um, I know people at the beginning of the show talked about portals, departures. That will probably happen on both sides of the football. Bo's back though, and the offense is going to be the key. But it's going to be the strength of the team in 2023, at least at this current moment. But it's a new OC again, so I mean, there's a lot of questions with this team.
Yeah, and to the original question, I'm in total agreement with what Matt said, and also with I removed the question from here, so I forget who brought it up, but yeah, we went into the year saying new offensive coordinator. Bronos, thank you, Bronos. But we came into the season going new offensive coordinator, and Kenny Dillingham hadn't been a full-time play caller in his career. Young guy, kind of a bit of an unknown, didn't really know exactly what to expect. So there was questions there, and then I think, for all being honest, like, who knew what Bo Nix was going to be this year?
Yeah.
That was a really big point of contention. Of like most people expected he would win the starting job over Ty, and I think it's played out that most people agree with that decision, obviously long term, but there was a real kind of concern about, like, what does Oregon have at quarterback? There was a ton of questions about running back, right? Like, most people assumed it would be Byron Cardwell would be the primary running back, and you just didn't really know what these transfer portal guys were, right? So you look at that, like, you didn't really know what they had at offensive coordinator. You weren't really sure what the quarterback would be, and you probably thought a running back who's basically didn't play all season was going to be the primary running back. And so the expectations for the offense were kind of out of whack for what ended up taking place, which was you had one of the most explosive offenses in the country. And now the question going into next year's are basically, how does this reshaped offensive line play out? As Matt said, I think 4 starters are gone, all of which were long-term guys who played a ton of football here. When you think about TJ Bass, Big Sala, Alex Forsythe, Ryan Walk, those are guys who played a ton of football here. They're gone. Oregon has done, I think, a really good job. In future podcasts, we'll talk about it, of replacing some of those guys. Stephen Jones recently did announce he was coming back. But, I think the offense you expect to be really good next year. The defense continues to be a big concern. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you, oh, they'll figure it out. They need to hit the portal hard. I like the current – I like the additions they've made so far through the portal. I'm obviously a big fan of a lot of the prep additions, but I look at the way they – and I said this a couple times before – I think it's tough when you bring in a coach and you have expectations, especially one like Dan Lanning from his time at Georgia, as just like what his defense is going to look like, but you don't have the personnel there to back it up. And I think Oregon was lacking in some pretty clear areas this year defensively. Didn't have a guy who was ever able to develop into a consistent pass rusher. Struggled with speed and pass coverage at linebacker. That was a huge issue, right? The secondary, I thought the safeties at times, and more than a few times, were a step slow. Didn't have maybe the needed athleticism and coverage ability. I think, as much as I love Bennett Williams, he had some really rough moments.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily put that all on him, because I think he was asked to play a position that's not his best position. I don't think he should be put in situations where he's matching up with slot receivers on a regular basis, because we saw what happened. He got beat he got beat several times deep. So a lot of this is personnel related, and I'm trying to be kind of cautiously optimistic they'll figure this out. But there's, I think, a lot of reworking to be done, and Oregon will have to be very diligent this offseason in terms of figuring out what the right steps are to kind of make all of that work out, because I do think Dan Lanning is a really, really smart football coach and will figure this out, but he needs his guys to ultimately play defense at the level that they need to compete for championships.
2 questions that I'm going to combine into one. First, or comments. Zay Sackett, maybe the Pac-12 is on the rise and getting more transfers and recruits. And hey, we're an open podcast. We're going to take questions from everybody. And so we're going to take a question or a comment from a Beaver and Connor Johnson that Pacific Northwest football is elite. There's something we can all agree on. Beavers win 10 games for the first time in a long time. Washington wins 10 games, back to where they were from a couple of years ago. Oregon wins 10 games. The Pac-12 being on the rise, with Utah getting back to the Pac-12 championship game, winning it, getting to the Rose Bowl for 2 years in a row. USC looked really good this season. That right there is 5 teams that I think you look at next season, Erik, and can say and point to that, hey, like any one of those 5 teams would win the league. And there'd be maybe a little surprise if Oregon State won it. But I think you could sell anybody on any of those 5 teams winning the league, and they're all probably going to go into next season ranked inside the top 25 for sure, but maybe even top 15, top 20.
My big thing is I think the quarterback play elevated itself so much this past offseason, and it appears to continue to do so. I mean, you just look around the conference and think about who's being replaced at quarterback and what they're being replaced by. Like the fact that DJ Uiagalelei is going to Oregon State, I still believe he's going to have a solid career. Guy has a ton of physical tools, and if we're being honest, that was a very disappointment recruitment for Oregon several years ago that he chose to go to Clemson over Oregon. Dante Moore flipping from Oregon, and this is an Oregon podcast. This hurts for Oregon fans. That's a really big addition for Chip Kelly down there. That's a immediate potential contributor as a starting quarterback. So I think the quarterback play in the conference is going to be really good going forward. I have concerns about a lot of other positions. I think saying that the Pacific Northwest is elite in football. I don't know if I'd go elite. I think there's some really competitive teams. I love the trajectory at Oregon, Oregon State, Washington. Shoot, I don't hate what Jake Dickert has done at Washington State. They played Oregon really tough, arguably tougher than just about anybody this season. And they knocked off Wisconsin. I know they kind of struggled down the stretch to close the season, had some losses you probably don't like to see, but like I think this part of the country has probably very rarely been as competitive across the board amongst these Pac-12 teams as they are right now. And then let's also just be real for a second. Pac-12 really needs it because it's about to become the Pac-10, and 2 of its banner members, USC and UCLA, are about to leave. And you need all of these teams to be really good to stay relevant, right?
Yep.
It's and the fact that Colorado has added Deion Sanders as its coach and a huge infusion of talent, that brings them up. The fact that I know people don't want to do this, but if you're a fan of the conference, you want Arizona State to be much better under Kenny Dillingham. You want to see some of the magic that worked in Eugene pay off down in Tempe as well, because if you can get all of the bottom teams to rise it up here, the conference can be really competitive across the board nationally. I still think they're a ways away from what we've seen from the SEC. Certainly, the Big Ten had 2 teams make the college football playoff this year. Their top is much, I think, stronger than the top of the Pac-12. But I think the saving grace maybe for George Kliavkov is if the rest of the conference can kind of reach itself up and pull itself up a little bit, it gives the conference more stability going forward. Because I think anybody who's been kind of following what's gone on with this league the last 6 months or so now has to be honest and say, like, the future is kind of daunting. You have to be a little bit concerned about where it's headed. You don't know the answer to what this league will look like in 5 to 6 years, or if it'll even necessarily be around. But the fact that I think you can probably speak with pretty encouraging, words about basically every team in this conference besides Cal and Stanford, I think that's a really good place, because I still think Jed Fish at Arizona is doing really good things too. So. Yeah. I know I rambled a little bit there, but kind of like I think you feel pretty decent about where a lot of these member schools are going, but there's going to have to be a collective effort for this conference to maintain kind of the momentum that is needed to stay afloat in the conference.
Okay, we're going to end the podcast with this question. It just came in from Fish Bio. Do you think the portal is becoming the equalizer for the Pac-12? And I think you could tie this into just directly with Oregon as well. Look at just the guys, the talent that Oregon brought in this season, the impact that those guys had. Obviously, it starts with Bo Nix, but there's Christian Gonzalez, there's Chase Cota, there's Bucky Irving, there's Noah Whittington, there's Taki Taimani, there's Jordan Riley, there's Casey Rogers. I think Dan Lanning said it maybe signing day or somewhere leading up to signing day that if you look at all the transfers that they brought in, there wasn't a single guy that did nothing during the season. They all had critical roles on this team, and I think you can go back and point to those additions as being huge for Oregon's transition under year 1 under Dan Lanning, having the success that they had. You look at the guys that they've added this year. Justin Jacobs, a linebacker, started at Iowa for 2 seasons. Trayshawn Holden, a starting wide receiver for Alabama this season. Kyrie Jackson, a guy that started a game in the national championship last season, played in all their games towards the end of the season before he got out of the lineup, had a start this season. Johnny Cornelius, an offensive tackle, the best offensive tackle in the transfer portal, 2-year starter at Rhode Island. Junior Anguilla, a 3-year starter at Texas who got hurt at the beginning of this season and didn't play for the Longhorns because of that injury. All these guys are starters when they're coming to Oregon. And then I think you look at across the conference, Bo Nix's success here at Oregon, Michael Penix's success at quarterback for UW. The list goes on and on. Cameron Ward at Washington State. Just a really good addition for each team in the portal, key players in the portal. And it seems like for Oregon, for the rest of the conference, this is a path for them to find elite talent that can help elevate their programs and make them better very quickly. And it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to be down on the portal because of the losses you see happen in all those schools. Like Oregon has had a ton of losses this offseason, I think 17 already. And I think we all expect that number to reach 22, maybe more, once it's all said and done. But for Oregon, it gives you an opportunity to go plug and plays. Matt just addressed that. And for a lot of the rest of the conference that doesn't recruit the prep players quite at the same level, it allows you to go find top-tier talent. And we've run through the quarterbacks that were added in the conference last season, the quarterbacks that will be coming this year with Oyunglele going to Oregon State, with Deion Sanders' son. I think it's Shedeur Sanders. I might have mispronounced his first name. I apologize. I have not watched a lot of Jackson State football. But he's going to Colorado, and I know that's a player people are really high on. You have the quarterback talent, that infusion. But there's also players across the board, like Oregon State, that roster, and I know some of our. It sounds like we have a couple Beaver listeners in this, which is kind of fun. Can kind of attest to the fact that the portal's been really good to Oregon State. And I know that roster probably a little better than some of the other schools in the conference just because of proximity. But yeah, Drew Pine, that's another name right there that Connor just mentioned, going to Arizona State from Notre Dame. But the conference has really improved, and some of the schools that struggle to recruit 4- and 5-star athletes out of high school are able to improve their rosters significantly with immediate players with the portal. And you looked at Oregon State's team this year, a lot of those guys didn't start their college careers in Corvallis. They started in other parts of the country, and those players ended up being big benefits for that program, just like I think it will be for the rest of the conference going forward. So we can probably get into some of that more down the line when we see what these rosters, when they get finalized, when the portal kind of finishes, and that's going to be 6-7 months from now. But yeah, I think it's been a really good thing for the conference, and you hope it continues to be a positive thing going forward, because as I said earlier, there's definitely uncertainty about where this conference is headed. But I also just, again, aside from Cal and Stanford, I think you look at the teams and the coaches and kind of the way things are going, I think you can have optimism with a lot of these programs, and the portal's been a big weapon for most of them.
We got a bunch of questions here at the end that I think are worth discussing. So we'll make sure to note those down. Great. It's late. It's been a long day. We'll write those down and save them maybe for the mailbag that we'll be doing later next week. Because there's some ones in here that I think we should discuss, like Tyler Shuck, or he just announced he's coming back after being the MVP of his bowl game. The impact there. There's another question about what does this win do for Dan Lanning and his staff? Should there be adjustments? Could we see some changes? And then some Deion Sanders questions, some recruiting questions as well. So there's a lot more we're going to get to. And thanks for joining us on this podcast, this live stream. We had almost 300 people almost at midnight tonight. I don't know what Erik and I were anticipating this to be like. It was our first post-game live edition. I think it went off well. Our coverage of this bowl win and this season and what transpires next is not done. Go to duckterritory.com for more on that because there's already stuff up. Jared's thrown a couple things up as we've done this podcast. Erik and I will throw a couple more things up between now and early tomorrow morning. And then just kind of unpacking and peeling back the layers of the 2022 football season will begin. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of what the data presents, how our opinions shift and change. I don't know if you've got any lasting thoughts, but I think this was the perfect way to send off the season how the regular season ended. A close game, a win over a Power 5 team that's got 9 wins on the season against a marquee coach and it sets you up for what could be an exciting 2023 season.
Yeah, I guess just my parting thought is I agree with a lot of what Matt said with the program, but just on I guess our podcast perspective, I think it's great we started working on utilizing the live stream function here. It's fun seeing so many people, as Matt said, late at night, checking it out, chopping it up with us, dropping in questions. It's fun having that interaction. And I think only more exciting things to come in 23. I know we're going to utilize this more. We've been kind of mapping out what the podcast is going to look like from January of this year through the start of the 2023 season. And we're certainly going to incorporate maybe one or two of these a week of having fans kind of interact with us through these live streams. We'll have some kind of more information. We finalize some of that stuff, but thanks for sticking with us and for joining. And if you're kind of new to the show, appreciate you stopping by and listen. Hopefully you liked what you heard and kind of the interaction here. I think it's really cool. I think Matt and I will both say we're very fortunate to do this professionally and be in these spots that we get to be in San Diego around the team, talking to players, the relationships we've built. And it's cool to be able to share some of that with people that are also invested in this program.
Yeah, absolutely. Ditto, Erik, ditto. That's going to be it for us. It's 11:30 on a Wednesday night. Erik and I have flights to catch tomorrow. Back to Eugene. Please, no delays, no cancellations. Good vibes in that area. We want to get back home, but our coverage of Oregon football will continue here on the Odds and Audibles podcast, here on YouTube, and also back at our home base, duckterritory.com. Consider subscribing. That's the most impactful way you guys can support us and continue these free podcast shows, live stream shows to continue happening. Because look, we're the only outlet that covers this team that sends 2 people to every football game, and we often send 3, sometimes even 4. We're the only outlet that does video, does podcast, does writing, does analysis. You supporting our work continues our coverage that we feel like is pretty top notch and very in depth of the Oregon Ducks. So strongly consider doing that if you can. But until the next episode here on the Odds and Audibles podcast, thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.